Good afternoon. How many of you were at one of my other sessions? Okay. The purpose of this session is going to be to focus on integrated lesson planning. So on the website, you not only have the PowerPoint, and if I set this up well, you also have a number of other documents that we will be referencing. So one of those documents is a general description of the lesson planning process. These are all PDFs on your. One of them is the template that will guide you through the steps of the work. This is a case study we're going to follow and apply the template stuff to today. So it says case study. Then there's a narrative guide for that template. So it takes each of the steps and amplifies them and gives you a lot more guidance in how to implement this process. There's also the template for the state of Indiana general education lesson planning. And we're going to address that just by reference. And there are 2 PDFs with that because there are 2 pages to it. And I didn't want to make it so small that you couldn't see it. So if you are not familiar with this document, then you could download it or do whatever you want. But everything that we're going to be referencing today is in one of these PDFs, which is, if you go to the FOI 2020 website, right on the front page, by presenter name, is all the stuff for each of their sessions. Let me just find out who's here. How many of you are general education teachers? Awesome. Special education teachers? Awesome. Principals? Okay, who am I missing rather than going through everything? Yes, ma'am. Finally. I know, I did. I must have missed it because I was commenting to Jolly last night. I said, I ask if there's SLPs in every session. I don't remember anybody putting their hand up. So awesome. Anybody else that I missed? Yes. Director of Special Ed, even awesomer. Okay, awesomer. Overall, the goal of this session is to walk through how we do lesson planning in the state I am from. And the purpose of it is to integrate lesson plans so that kids with disabilities have one instructional plan with a lot of supports. There are a couple of slides on here to put context that if you've been in previous sessions, you're going to see them. But I want to go through them pretty quickly so that people who weren't here have a little contextual background. So integrating specially designed instruction across the tiers. How many of you are in a district where MTSS is at least talked about, if not implemented? Okay, close to half. So the MTSS framework is just a way that we distribute our tasks and our resources to meet the needs of kids that have different intensity of needs. So if you're not doing MTSS, I started working as a school psychologist in Indiana in 1972. Some of your parents weren't even born then. That was long before we had special ed. That didn't happen until 1975. And we have been iterating it ever since. But even when I started working up in Merrillville, we had general education, we had title, we had other kinds of support. So education's always had tiers of service. So finally, about 15, almost 20 years ago, this framework became known as multi-tiered system of supports. So Tier 1 lesson planning, let's take a look quickly at what Indiana has as its template for general education lesson planning. Now, I have found, because I get to work in Indiana a lot, I'm actually here frequently. is that, and I said in the previous session, this is the best lesson planning template I've ever seen in any state that I work in. And I work in a number of them. What is amazing to me is I don't think I've necessarily met one person in Indiana who actually knows it exists. So this will be new learning for you, although you should be teaching this to me. You guys are the teachers in this state. So I just want to go over the flow of this, particularly for special ed personnel that may not be involved in general education lesson planning, either at the grade level or subject area. So basically, these lesson planning documents start with a standard, and they end with all of the basic things that you are planning to do to implement instruction that's tied to some kind of learning goal. Indiana doesn't call it a learning goal. The term that they use for it is a learning target, but it's the same thing. This thing is 2 pages long. If you want to pull it up as a PDF, you can see it. So you first state the standard. It's a little bit, for those of you doing IEPs, after you fill out all the stuff, first thing you do is to get your IEP goals, you state the standard, right? So that's the way this starts. And then from that standard, you develop learning targets, learning goals. The third thing is basically relating the learning to the students. What that means is that you are going to have to ensure kids have the background to engage the focus of the lesson. And one of the issues with our struggling students, whether that's cultural, racial diversity, socioeconomic diversity, disabilities, different languages, if kids don't share the common background for the task, the ones who do have it are going to do well, and the ones who don't have it have to do double and triple, and they tend to be the kids who are at risk the most for doing double and triple. So that is a key element, particularly with our kids with disabilities. Assessment, what's going to define success for the learning target? You have to say, and what your tool is, if you will. And then the content of the standards. And the cool thing about Indiana is that they have, for grades 6 and 12, they lump literacy, history, social studies, all of that into one, because literacy, it involves reading for all of those areas. I think that's cool. The second page of it ensures, number 6, is that the academic vocabulary of the lesson is understood by everybody. So in one of the other sessions we did, we talked about a 6-step self-regulated strategy development approach for our kids with disabilities. And the first step is background knowledge, and one of the steps in there includes a teacher highlighting vocabulary or vocabulary concepts that may not be familiar to all the kids. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the steps. The next thing is examples, activities, and tasks. The third step, for those of you who are here in one of the other sessions, for that 6-step strategy approach to instruction, the third thing was teacher models, so examples. So this lesson planning that you have in Indiana is following normal strategy-based instructional development principles, which is really good, very evidence-based. Now, let's get to the last 3, and this is in particular at the general education planning level, where special ed and general ed are going to start coming together in this plan. So resources and materials. The question, what technology and media tools will be used in this lesson to deepen learning? So we know that media tools and technology are things that our kids with disabilities very much engage and can backfill some of their background knowledge, deficit areas, what have you. That's an explicit requirement of step 8. So let's assume you're sitting in on a lesson planning meeting with a 4th grade PLC. At this point, if your kids have fluency deficits and need access to grade level content, 5th grade student reading fluently at the 2nd grade level. They can't read the content, so they can't do the comprehension stuff. They can't address the comprehension standards. You can bring to the table any technology or media resources that you use in your work with the students to increase their access to content. The next step on this speaks specifically to so that's that one. The next step on this speaks to ensuring that all students have access to and are able to engage appropriately in this lesson. So what do you do with a fifth grade kid in fifth grade reading at the second grade level? Oral and silent reading fluency is second grade level. This number 9 asks you to address explicitly how you are going to, with that deficit, ensure access to grade level content. So an example might be text-to-speech. It also could be computer-assisted instruction. Interestingly, I have 7 grandkids. That's not the interesting part of it. That's the exhausting part of it. My 2 oldest go to a school where for everything that they do in that school, whatever the tasks are and what have you, and homework in particular. In this school, nobody gets homework until 4:30. It comes out in an email blast to everybody. School is over about 2:45, but they give the kids a break. It's a pretty demanding school, and so they want the kids to have some chill time. For everything that they have been taught about the homework, there are connections, internet connections, to additional stuff, reteaching. So they connect stuff to Khan Academy, where they're teaching that same concept. They use Pearson in this school, so there's a Pearson supports. So for every aspect of the curriculum, you can click on a link and it will take you to somebody who's reteaching that concept. That's the general idea. Our kids with disabilities need more exposure, repeated exposures to instruction in order to have a fighting chance. Remember, academic engaged time, the number of minutes a week that a student engages instruction, is the best predictor of growth for all students. So therefore, time moderates behindedness. It also is one of the mitigators for your kids for whom the pacing in general education is too fast for them. They're moving too fast. Well, you can utilize this stuff to mitigate more exposure to it. Will help those kids keep up, particularly with the content. The last one that is as part of this is what evidence-based strategies for differentiation for all students can be provided. That may seem oxymoronic to you. Differentiate for all students? As I said earlier, that may cause you to have nightmares. I have 25 kids. How am I going to differentiate for all students? You can't. That's not what this sentence means. This sentence means, how do you pick instructional strategies that are evidence-based for the diverse needs of the kids in your class? That way, even though you have one instructional strategy, kids with different needs can engage it differentially. Because you can't differentiate for everybody, not unless you're doing individualized or personalized learning model. So this is a reminder to select instructional strategies in Tier 1 that diverse learners can engage. And we've had a couple of other sessions talking about what that looks like. I have 2 slides here just to give you an example when we get there, but that's not what the purpose of this session is. So I would encourage you, if you're going to be exploring this integrated lesson planning, that you've got to have a template. People have to go through the same process repeatedly to get better at it. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But you have to have some approach to it. You could embed what I'm going to talk about today into this approach. Or you could use the templates that I've provided for you. You can just do a deeper dive. So I would like to give you 3 minutes at your table, and I want you to discuss how right now lesson planning occurs in your building or in your district. Okay? 3 minutes and I'll time you on my phone. Thank you. How many of you have a systematic way that your district or school expects you to lesson plan? Okay, let's go home. So I want to just give you a quick story. The first time I became a building principal in Bloomington Normal, I spent probably the first 3 months just doing a listening and learning tour, sitting in classrooms, looking at instruction, looking at how supports were delivered. I didn't do much except establish relationships with people and try to get the culture, the existing culture, into my head. So my background knowledge, okay? And then by the middle of the year, I had to start doing observations for new teachers, and you know the schedule with that. So I started doing that, and I found teaching that I thought I learned from watching. It was amazing. It's like, how do you know how to do that? And I saw other teaching where I thought, have you ever learned how to do that? And I was really confused by that. And then, because I'm such a sports person, and I'm also a person that believes in everything I do, I don't do it unless I feel adequately prepared to do it. Because every time I try to do something I'm not prepared to do, I screw it up. And then it's a waste of time. Then I got to go back and do it over again. So I'm one of those guys that when I'm doing, wood things or what have you, I measure 4 times and cut once, even if I know I'm right. Because once I cut it, wood's expensive. And then plus you got to go to the lumber yard. I mean, now you've lost time. So I thought, I had a hypothesis. I'm trying to problem solve. Why do some teachers know how to teach and others seem to just be reacting to students and what have you? And so I thought, I want to see how they plan their instruction. So I quit observing classrooms, and I started going and sitting in on grade level and subject area lesson planning meetings. And what I saw for the fantastic teachers was unbelievable planning, where groups would challenge each other. If we do that, these kids won't be able to do it. How are you going to expect blah, blah, blah? That's awesome. And they ended up coming up with an agreement on, for that grade level, how they were going to approach these learning goals. And for the others, it was a social get-together. They brought, typical of educators, we always bring candy and all that kind of stuff to every meeting. And there was nothing systematic going on in that planning. They generally talked about the standards, but there was no professional thinking about the science of instruction. So then I quit observing classrooms. I did it when I had to because of a new teacher. I did all that stuff. But we came together as a faculty and we talked about how are we going to plan for instruction. And we shored up our planning process first. Then, and I said, I'm not talking about different teaching styles. I'm also looking at different outcomes for kids. Can we come to consensus that planning will make us better teachers? Took a little bit, but some of them had been planning on their own, so they didn't really need to get into this act. But we came to consensus. We then, as a staff, we looked at different lesson planning models, and we came to agreement on one. And then we did professional learning on it, and I set it up so that different grade level staff would observe different grade level lesson planning meetings for fidelity checks. It was a colleague-to-colleague process of job-embedded learning. It took the whole year. But once we got it done, it was amazing. So I then did teacher evaluations based upon both their planning and their delivery of instruction. So that's why this stuff is so very important. And as a building principal, it's important that you can problem solve when teachers need additional supports to have more effective instruction. And without a process, you don't know how to do that. So that's why it's important. And so given the fact that nobody raised their hand, that should be a courageous conversation in small groups. And when you get back to the ranch, just have thoughts about that. I don't know, particularly with kids who have behavior issues, for kids who are struggling, I don't know how, when your instructional plan doesn't work, you can on the fly fix it. I don't know how to do that. Because you're now down to, you only have 60 minutes for math. How are you going to fix it and reteach it with something that is just another thought you have about, well, I'll try this. Our kids deserve better than that. So, important issues. Lesson design and delivery is about ensuring students are successful in attaining standards. Teaching and learning process includes expectations and responsibilities for both students and educators. So the engagement part of students in this lesson planning process is, what do you mean by engagement? Does that mean not bothering you? Does that mean not going off task? A lot of our kids with disabilities, they don't look engaged because they don't feel confident enough to do it, and other kids don't look engaged and they're fully engaged because they have 100% accuracy levels. They just don't. So how do you want kids to be engaged? Based upon their needs, engagement should look different. So, and then the environment in which the teaching and learning process occurs includes evidence-based teaching strategies for the needs of the kids that you're serving. So if you, after today, and hopefully not now, I really don't care if you do it now. If you're doing online shopping, that's probably not good. It's not good for your bank account nor for your time in here. You could Google effective general education instruction in reading for kids with learning disabilities, and you'll be shocked at what pops up. And it's going to be a lot of the strategy-based learning stuff. Collaborative strategic reading, enhanced anchored instruction, strategic instruction model. It's there. And interestingly, all of it is evidence-based first for general education kids, and then back evidenced for kids with disabilities, and also ELs with and without disabilities. So you can find this stuff if you simply ask the right question. I don't know that Siri knows the answer to it. I can tell you Alexa does not. Alexa's good at telling you if you need a coat. We talked in the other session about the need for inclusion means not that a kid is put into an environment, but that the environment becomes inclusive of the kid. We have to stop looking at it from the kid perspective. We have to look at it from the environment perspective. So therefore, in lesson planning, you have 3 kids with disabilities. You have an EL. We're going to do a case study here in a second. I give you a classroom with different makeup. You've got all of those. And then you look at your instruction and you realize what you're planning to do is not inclusive of all of those kids. So now how do you make it inclusive? And I urge people not to run around thinking about differentiation and accommodations and modifications of the existing when you can deliver. That's a lot of work. You can deliver instruction to the entire group, and these kids will access it differentially. That's much easier on teachers. So this process forces us to have that conversation. And effective behavioral and social emotional practices are included in lesson design and delivery. You have a lot of kids who may not appear to be motivated. They don't engage. They don't respond. You have kids with ADHD who are impulsive. You have a whole variety of kids for which social emotional supports need to be in there. I'm going to give you a reference for the one source of teaching strategies that I think meets those needs. And then school-wide and behavioral social emotional practices are included if you have school-wide positive behavior supports, if you have youth mental health first aid for all of your staff, if you have all of these things that increases the capacity of every person in your building to create a climate that is safe, a climate that is responsive, and a climate kids want to be in, then it'll make the impact of your instruction a whole lot greater. A whole lot greater. So although that's not in your lesson planning. That's leadership in your school and your teacher leaders that are working on school climate stuff. So you have a handout. It's called, it's the one that says aligning, and it should look like this. I should have named it drivers because that's the first thing that comes up here. This is an overall document that you could share with your colleagues and to have them understand in a nutshell the why and what of this. So it's a good, book club to get some conversations going so that you don't have to come in and say, I went to this conference, I heard about this, that, and the other thing. Just have people read this and then have a discussion. The purpose of it is to establish some common language, common understanding around what drives this, what is the need for it, what is the purpose of it, and what the process generally looks like. We're not going to use it today. All of our lesson planning is driven by universal design for learning principles. Now, if you wanted to use the Indiana lesson planning, these principles really come to focus in steps 8, 9, and 10. Those steps that I reviewed with the highlighted things. But this is a climate of lesson planning. So it's a belief about lesson planning. So I would say, I believe that when we plan lessons, we have very diverse learners. We need to think about different ways of presenting this information. We have diverse learners. I grew up in South America. I'm fluent in Spanish because it was my first language, actually. My wife and I took a trip to Portugal. Portuguese is a Romance language. The spelling of Portuguese is very similar to Spanish. So I could read road signs. I could read the Portuguese. But they didn't pronounce it like in Spanish. Any of you know Spanish? Okay. So rain. It's raining out today. Rain is lluvia. In Portuguese, L-L-U-V-I-A is chuva. I'm like, seriously? That makes absolutely no sense. But because there were different ways of presenting their language, verbally and visually, I could access content in Portugal if I could read it. People would talk to me and I'd be like, no bueno, not good, this isn't working. And all it took was a different way that matched my background knowledge. That's all we're talking about. It's common sense. It's common sense. The second principle is saying not everybody can demonstrate their knowledge the same way. And we've had multiple conversations with this group last and this session with the idea that we cannot focus on high stakes assessment methodology, I learned, those kinds of things, because that's a one way of performing. And for kids with disability, those assessments simply measure the disability. And guess what? We already know the kid has that disability. We don't need another assessment to tell it to us. And if somebody would simply file a class action lawsuit that says that denies equity and access for kids with disabilities to demonstrating their competency, they would win. Nobody's done it that I'm aware of. It would not stand the test. You can't have tests required to make judgments about kids with disabilities, yet require their disability as the way to access the test. I mean, a judge would be like, that's stupid, I don't even need to read the law. So let's not use the test. Let's keep not going to the test. Let's talk about us as educators and what we want to do given the flexibility we have to do whatever we want. So, and then let the test deal with itself. The last thing is, how do we engage students in this process? So I'm going to, let me see if I can jump ahead to this. I'm going to jump ahead to something. So in one of the other sessions, I talked about Kathleen Lane's work at the University of Kansas, and she has this very inexpensive, amazing book. And it has 7 strategies to engage students during the delivery of instruction. So in our lesson planning, we'll come to that. We'll come back to it. But in our lesson planning, when we get to that third principle, and we talk about students who aren't engaged, we have Kathleen Lane's 7 strategies in front of us. And we talk about which of these strategies can we use when we deliver instruction that will further engage students. My favorite is OTR, opportunity to respond. We know the more students respond in class, the faster they grow in their skills. But a lot of our students don't want to do that. They don't have the skill, they blah, blah. So, and teachers tend to pick on kids who already know the answer because that validates the fact that the instruction's working. But these strategies are how to scaffold kids to increase their opportunities to respond successfully. And it's data you can collect. The other one, the huge strategy for our kids, and every special educator, psychologist, speech and language person who works with our kids should teach them how to ask questions. They don't know how. And a teacher doesn't know how to help a kid unless a kid can ask a question that reflects what their need is for the task. And any of the social skills training curricula like skill streaming, second step, all of that kind of stuff, they have explicit training models for teaching kids how to ask questions related to the task. Not the ADHD kid who in the middle of language arts says, when are we going on the field trip? That's not asking a relevant question. But saying, I need help. I don't understand this. As opposed to our kids, because we enable them in some ways, just say, I can't do it. And then we rush in to rescue them. There's no skills that they have to analyze why they can't do something. And then to ask for specific help. So it's that part of it is important. So we can, in our lesson planning, we can just pick the stuff we've always done, or we can do this diverse learner kind of thing we've been talking about. So principle one, there's all sorts of ways that we can convey instruction. And all of those. It will depend upon what ones you're comfortable with, what ones you know. I was having a conversation, I don't know if the person is in here. She's not. That's okay. Talking about they use Orton Gillingham for their K1 kids that are struggling. And she said, is that something that can be done for all kids so that we're not doing this with some kindergartners and OG with the others? And I said, yeah. I said, in a district I just finished working with, the kindergarten teachers did a little test. They identified the kids who were struggling. They identified all the letters that they were having either naming, sound, symbol association, some of the phonemic awareness kinds of things around those letters. And they divided the letters in half. Not the kids in half, they divided the letters in half. And they taught half of the letters the way that they were teaching everybody. And they taught half of the letters the way using a multisensory approach. It wasn't quite Orton Gillingham, but it was a multisensory approach. The data were unbelievable. It looked like this. They made a decision in that district to teach all kindergartners utilizing a multisensory approach. So they didn't have to worry about using an approach to find out which kids couldn't do it, then pulling those kids out. I mean, that's kind of what we do now, right? So they found universal instruction for kindergarten. And they're like, well, other kids, it's not going to hurt them to learn this way. And we can, one size fits all here. Why do we have to wait for a response to instruction to tell us they can't learn it when we know what intervention is going to be best and we front load it? That's the philosophy here. We talked in a couple of the other sessions about self-regulated strategy development. And when we teach, we always use something similar to this. So all of this universal instruction that works for kids with disabilities, ELs, with and without disabilities, that I've talked about previously, and that I'll just throw a couple up here, it follows these 6 strategies. It can be used in the lesson plan, but the goal is for the kids to learn the strategies by repeated exposure to them. The other thing is that this strategy-based instruction puts the kids in your class as having responsibility for their own learning. So on these tables, there is a facilitator. There is a person who does the written product. People have roles. They're taught to do it. And if for literacy stuff, if it's complex text, somebody with fluency at grade level reads it to everybody. Because with kids with disabilities and other, we're not talking here about, it's not a fluency test. It's a comprehension test. So by this combined skill sets and supports within that group, kids are taught to go through. It takes about 6 to 10 exposures of doing this for kids to get it. So initially, the teacher goes through the steps, and then the teacher has an example of applying the steps. But the teacher facilitates each of the steps. The teacher has trained the kid facilitators ahead of time. And then the teacher, first few times, walks them through each individual step. Then the teacher says, I'm going to ask you at your table to do the first 2 steps on your own. Your facilitator will guide you through it. Then 3 steps. You got the picture here? But if kids learn that every time they do something in reading, math, science, social studies, it follows these steps. That's what the structure that our kids with disabilities need. And other kids benefit from it as well. So with these strategy-based instruction I'm going to show these quickly for people who weren't here. This is an example of using collaborative strategic. All these things have strategic in them because of the strategy base. Growth rates for typical kids are at the top. Growth rates for kids with disabilities in that classroom is the second. And the third one is rates of growth for kids with disabilities where the strategy was used in small group or pull out. 2 things here. The rates of growth of kids with disabilities can match the rates of growth for typical kids. But the gap closing is where special ed comes in and really works on some of those skills to close the gap. The general education requirement is to do no harm. Don't let kids get worse. And if they can keep kids moving, special ed then can focus on gap closing strategies. The second takeaway from this is that kids grow faster if they get this approach to instruction in the general education classroom. I'll do one more. I think this is strategic. Sound familiar? Strategic instruction model. Don Deschler's work out of Kansas. Same kind of things, except they're content enhancement routines. And guess what? They have steps in them. Kids learn the steps to content enhancement. It's all about steps that kids can incorporate into their own learning strategies. This happens to be one of our middle schools in Florida. Blue is all kids. Orange is kids with disabilities. Gray is learning gains for everybody. Yellow is learning gains for the kids in the bottom 25th percentile. Kids with disabilities more than doubled their rate of progress in the first year alone. They did it a year. By the end of the second year, they had more than doubled their rate of progress. Also, kids in the bottom 25th percentile grew as fast, just about as fast, as all of the other typical kids. And those are kids on free and reduced lunch. Those are kids that are at risk for reasons other than a disability. And this was all general education teachers in that middle school utilized strategic instruction model. And these kids were continuing to get special ed services, continuing to get EL services, continuing to get title if that was appropriate. But all of those supports were not battling on their own to be the lift for these kids. All those supports together, the lift is too heavy. Gen Ed's got to come to the table. And we did surveys with teachers. How do you like this? Is it too much work? Teachers loved it because the kids do half the work. And when they're engaged in this, they're not misbehaving and being silly. So that's the general gist of this. Okay. Ways of expression, we already went over that. Means of engagement, these 6 strategies. It's opportunity to respond. It's pre-correction, which is pre-teaching. It's different ways of supervision and feedback to kids. There are 7 of them, I'm sorry. And I have a slide with the 7 up here. I would strongly urge that you buy a copy of this book. I get nothing for whatever I recommend to you, obviously. And look at it, and the goal of it here is what strategies can teachers use in the delivery of instruction, rather than waiting for kids to go off, to keep kids engaged. So every one of these 7 strategies is evidence-based to increase engagement. So in the lesson planning, we have that template in front of us so that we can talk about. In a school, we implement this in a book club model. 1 strategy a month. Teach it, embedded job, professional learning stuff. Give everybody a month to try it. Come back together. How did it work? What else? You got it, you don't got it, you need more support. Next month, add another one. Only takes 7 months to get everybody in your school competent with these 7 strategies to increase student engagement. So just anchors. So the overview of this, the flow of it, is step 1, all teachers who are involved with instruction for a grade or subject attend integrated lesson planning. We do it once a month. I said last hour, and just giving a quick overview, we use Google Docs for all of our lessons plans. And anybody who modifies a lesson plan, let's say a Tier 1 teacher modifies a lesson plan, everybody who on the group gets, you know what happens when a Google Doc is modified, you get pinged. So you don't even have to, after that first lesson plan, you don't have to get back together. You know if the pacing has changed in Tier 1. You know if teachers have added new materials, and you can then incorporate them as a special educator. But if they add stuff and you don't know anything about it, how are you going to incorporate it into your instruction? You have to have a way to communicate that scope, sequence, and pacing in Tier 1. After that, everybody's together, then Tier 2, Tier 3, EL, specially designed, you meet as a group to talk about any changes you have to do in your instruction to align with what's happening in Tier 1. You then communicate with Tier 1 about what you're doing instructionally. All you would have to say is, I'm going to start utilizing pre-teach, review, and reteach in advance of the materials you're covering. Utilizing Tier 1 materials for our kids with disabilities and other kids at risk is critical in our delivery of instruction. We cannot be using materials that don't have transferability to Tier 1. Cognitively, kids can't do it. It requires abstract level of cognitive development to be able to take something without concrete, for a kid to transfer the concept from one environment to another, basic child development stuff. That usually occurs, you can figure average kids have it by 10 to 12. Kids with disabilities are more delayed. They need concrete operations. That's where they're stuck. So they need concrete representation of stuff. So if you're doing direct instruction with all your specialized stuff, utilizing the social studies book, then when the kid goes back to Tier 1, there is that connectivity. For elementary and early middle school, it's critical. And step 4 is that Tier 2, Tier 3, special ed, EL, all these other instructional staff observe their kids in Tier 1 on some kind of regular basis. You don't have to be there every day, but at least once a month. For kids who are really struggling, once every 2 weeks. If you're doing co-teaching, you have some benefits there that can be done in the process of the co-teaching. Okay, this is a lesson design and integration template. If you want to open that up on your PDF. I'm hurrying here so that we can get to the case study. Do you have the gist of this? Do you have the flow, those 4 steps? Start out with general education lesson planning, utilizing the 3 components of UDL, and then you're sitting there listening. What can my kids do? Communicating when that's going to be a problem, and thinking to yourself, what do I have to do to mitigate stuff under this condition? Am I confusing anybody, or does that make common sense to you? Logistically, it's harder to schedule this stuff than it is to do it. That's why we only do it once a month. Because standards, the same standards occur for all year. We're just increasing complexity and those kind of things. And 4 weeks of lesson plans. In general, we do really tight 2 weeks of lesson plans. The last 2 weeks are a little less tight because teachers don't want to commit because of pacing issues and what have you. But we have Google Docs. In general, you know what they're planning to do in weeks 3 and 4. More specifics can come to you in Google Docs. It will change how you teach as a special educator. You will never again not want to know what's going on in Tier 1 to link to it. So you become acculturated to it very quickly. So this document, and I'm going to just show it to you. If you pull it up, I need to also pull it up so I can scroll it. So you see here that the standard is written at the top. Thank you. For those who were here yesterday, my computer and this thing, they don't have a perfect relationship. I don't know who is the problem. So the standard is at the top. That's the same as the Indiana lesson planning. You know that when you unpack standards, the nouns are what kids need to know. The verbs are how they're supposed to do it. So particularly for special educators who may not have been trained in lesson planning and unpacking standards, principles, we have some principles here. You really need to scaffold your special ed teachers because they don't get it in special ed teacher school. They get how to do deficit focus and IEPs and what have you. States, I know that Indiana, from my work with the IRPRC, a lot of times when they do stuff for general ed teachers around curriculum, they don't invite special ed teachers. So here's all this stuff changing and you guys aren't at the table. You need to self-invite. Excluding those teachers is ridiculous. So you have another document that explains every one of these steps. So you unpack the standards, and at this point, what I like to do is identify, here's what they need to know, here's what they need to do. At that point, you're going to be thinking about access skills. So if the teachers are saying, here's what they need to know, background, you're going, my kids don't know any of that. I need to write down and backfill some of the background. Do, and let's say that fluency, independent reading, they can't do it, not at grade level. So we write down access information, access skills that the kids lack. Those are things we have to overcome as special educators and others. So the flow, I'm not going to go through this, all of it, because the flow follows those 4 steps. Tier 1 staff identifies instructional strategies and pacing. Student performance expectations. Staff identifies students for whom performance expectations will be a problem and which specific expected behaviors are a problem. The entire group discusses strategies to reduce or eliminate the barriers to student performance. So this is pretty straightforward, and with your guide, you have a lot more narrative. The team reviews the plan and discusses the pacing guide. That's hugely important for our kids with disabilities. How fast the general ed curriculum moves is a huge threat to our kids. The Tier 2, 3 SDI and support providers articulate what they're going to do and how it aligns with Tier 1. And in addition, successful strategies used in Tier 2 and 3 are shared with the Tier 1 staff at that initial meeting. The next series of things is what you do as a support instructional staff after the lesson planning meeting. And I'm not going to go through all of those. There is an integrity checklist here, so that if you want to start practicing this, you can observe each other and you can check off how well you're implementing each of these steps. So I included the integrity checklist in case you want to have a way to do fidelity checks. The rest of it should be things that you just need to address, and they're very aligned with 8, 9, and 10 on the Indiana lesson planning. So let me just stop here very quickly and ask you, is this making sense? Do you understand it? I'm not asking you, do you know how to go and implement it? Do you understand the model? Okay, yes?
Do you ever see see administrators using the integrity checklist when they're watching?
That's a good question. What's your first name?
Kristen.
Kristen? So, it depends on leadership philosophy. As a building principal, I used integrity checklists that would be aligned with some of the observation criteria for teacher evaluation. I prefer that until teachers ask, that they use collegial observations for integrity checklists. As I had awesome relationships with the staff in the building, I've always used a collective leadership style. I've never used a hierarchical one. But the fact is, I was the building principal. I did evaluations. And you can never undo that. So this should be collegial. The other thing is, and if you email me, my email's on the front of the thing, I will send it to you. We have a whole, and they're on time in these sessions to do all this. I have a whole process that is evidence-based, developed by George Knoll at Louisiana State University, that is a support, it's a 3-step support process to improve fidelity of implementation that doesn't involve direct observation, checklist, critiques. It involves an interactive, reflective thinking about things. It's very simple. I can send you the documents if you send me. So let's go back to the other so we can go through this case study quickly. I'm assuming that you're understanding this. Patience is a virtue. Any of you ever go to Catholic school? I did. Oh, I got in trouble all the time. The nuns would come up and like slap my wrists, and I'd never forget this, starting in kindergarten. Patience is a virtue, possess it if you can. Seldom in a woman, never in a man. Now that was just not good beliefs about guys. This is the lesson study guide that follows each of the steps of the template. Let's have a case study. Pull up your case study, and I'll go over the highlights of it. And the next group of slides is integrating this case study into each of the steps I already went through. But I'm going to skip the steps. I reiterate the steps and then show you what this team did. This is an actual case. And I'm going to show you the outcome of this, okay? So, very simple. This is a 6th grade, and I pick 6th grade for these kind of things because sometimes we have secondary people and elementary, and it's a nice little bridge. So, 6th grade, 24 kids in the class. Is that about what you have in your classes? 24, 25, 20? Is that accurate? Okay. Here is the standard. Now, that's the state's name for the standard. You have the same stuff in Indiana. They got all sorts of numbers by them and what have you. Determine the theme or central idea of a text and how it is conveyed through particular details. Provide a summary of the text distinct from personal opinions or judgments. Notice the standard, and you have this standard in Indiana. It's a different number, but you got it. It's amazing, even though we all reject Common Core standards. Most of them are Common Core standards that states, including my own, have changed the name on, but they're still Common Core standards. Notice none of these standards say how kids have to access the content or how they have to convey it. So what do kids have to know here? They have to know what a theme or a central idea is. They have to know what details mean. They have to know what a summary is. And they have to know what personal opinions and judgments are, separate from facts. Okay? That's the know. The do is that they have to determine, they have to convey, and they have to provide. That's it. The rest of it, you determine how all that happens. This class has 24 students. Oh, so the class time is 60 minutes. The format is the teacher does 20 minutes of large group presentation. You'll see what that is in a moment. 20 minutes of small group, 4 groups, work, 15-minute individual group report, and 5-minute transition time. So they have to do this as a group. They're given a guide for what they have to convey, and those are the breakdown of the times. Each group has a timer. If the kids are not old enough to have a timer and make sense of it, the teacher serves as the timer. 24 kids in the class. Typically, 15 to 18 are able to participate in the large group presentation and learn from it. 2 students with learning disabilities and 3 other students do not possess fluency skills to read grade level material. However, their comprehension skills are close to grade level when accessing content is not dependent on oral or silent reading. In addition, their written language is close to their fluency level and not functional for grade level. Remember, once you establish the fluency level of a kid, if they comprehend at their fluency level, they probably don't have comprehension problems as a major issue. They also should be able to write at their fluency level, do spelling and those kinds of things. So if you want to know, does the kid generally get this stuff, then check them out at their fluency level. Look at their comprehension, see what they can write. Now, take away the fluency requirement and do it again without the fluency and the written, and you will see what happens to their comprehension. So when I first started working in Indiana as a school psychologist, I took a bunch of classes in reading from this amazing person at Ball State. She was president of the International Reading Association. She was amazing, very demanding. I also took a language development course from her. And what was that? Why am I telling you that? Oh, that was at the time where informal reading inventories, structured, were just being developed. IRIs. Now IRI means something else. There you go. And we didn't have very many of them. So I took the idea of it, and I made a 3x3 factorial. Independent, instruction, frustration levels, oral, silent, listening. And I would conduct assessments for every one of the boxes. And invariably, the listening comprehension level was so much higher than the other stuff. So we've been doing this concept for a long time. We just haven't been changing our methods of instruction to adapt to it. 2 of the 3 non-SLD and 2 additional students, I forget what they have. If you look on yours, I don't want to dive out of this again. They also presented some other challenges. Thank you. So here are the effective, we've already gone through this overview. Let's see how this team, what did they come up with? So the staff identifies they went through all of these steps, and their product is this. Tier 1 instruction. Tier 1 decided to implement collaborative strategic reading for all 6 students in 6th grade as a way to teach comprehension strategies. UDL Principle 1. That would go with Indiana's definition of differentiation for all students. Student performance. Students with reading fluency difficulties will provide verbal responses to comprehension probes using either speech-to-text, teacher interactive, or other strategies involving verbal responding. Principle 2, access to content. Some students will use text-to-speech technology to access subject content. Now, notice I said here, some students. At that point, there were other struggling learners in this class that had low levels of fluency that weren't kids with disabilities. So this strategy was going to be applied to all of those kids. Collaboration. Tier 1 will provide lesson plans in advance to Tier 2, Tier 3, and SDI providers. In this school, Tier 2 was basically the classroom teacher doing reteach for small groups. Also, it was title services. And specially designed instruction was special ed. They really did not have a functional Tier 3. They were not able to provide intensive interventions. They just didn't have that service. So the next step is where all of us get together. So let's jump ahead to see what their outcomes were. And if you saw me go through this quickly, it's the same format for you, but your narrow focus are the kids that struggle. So level 2 SDI instruction, Brian and others. This kid's name is Brian. Brian and others. Notice that there's really no tier level 3 here. Level 2, SLD students will participate in a level 2, tier 2. This state that this came from does not have a tiered system. They call it levels 1, 2, and 3. That refers to their multi-tiered system of supports, their multi-level system of supports. So don't think it's something else. Level 2, reading group instruction, twice a week. That was a Title I service. Pre-teach, review, and reteach instructional strategies, use grade level materials, focus on exposure to content, and reteach as necessary, focus on comprehension strategies aligned with what the teacher was doing in Tier 1. Specially designed instruction will participate in small group 3 students 5 times a week. Focus on fluency enhancement strategies, use grade level materials, pace to level Tier 1 to apply fluency strategies, errorless learning strategies, and vocabulary monitoring. But it was all tied to that Tier 1 stuff. Student performance, appropriate students will receive instruction and support in the use of speech to text and text to speech. I was talking with the group here. I gave an example yesterday very quickly of a teacher doing this type of thing in middle school and had 2 kids with reading issues. And while the other kids were reading the text, these 2 kids had text to speech and they had the earphones on. And the kids were in middle school and they really didn't like being the only ones with the earphones, so they told the teacher they didn't want to do it. And this was a very awesome teacher. And she just said, I'll fix that. She made all the kids wear the headphones. Very cool. And to her shock, the comprehension levels of the kids who could read dropped. And that's because the strategies you use when you do listening comprehension are not the same as you do when you have printed text. There's an overlap. But you can keep going back and reread a sentence, reread a word, get context cues, all of that kind of stuff. With listening, you have to learn to start and stop it. You have to stop and think about it. Think about when you read a book on, you go to the beach and you read a book on your Nook. Or you have the book. You put the book down every once in a while, you think about it. You probably don't do that on your Nook. You just listen to it. So anytime we use technology to access Tier 1 stuff, we must ensure that the kids are trained to use the technology in a way that meets the access requirements. And the text-to-speech thing is big. Kids learn it quickly, but you can't assume that they do. The other thing that drives me crazy, particularly with our kids with disabilities, is put them on computers, and we think because they're engaged with the computer, they know how to use computer assist. They don't. They need to be trained on how to do that. Otherwise, it's just kiddie dump-off. Okay. Assessment for these kids and calibration. So, Tier 2. This, I should have said level 2. Assessment. Assessment in Tier 2 will mirror the assessment that will be used in Tier 1. At least the general format. We don't want our assessments in Tier 2 and SDI to look different. Kids can't transfer. Now, the assessment might be they'll have it read on tape, but you want the same kind of format as those teachers in Tier 1 are using when they assess kids. Practice using listening comprehension strategies and verbal responding will be provided. Specially designed instruction. Assessment of fluency will focus on content from grade level materials using student instructional level of reading fluency. You can use them, if you're using Dibbles or you're using Renaissance Learning, Star Reading, Star Math, you can also do that stuff. That still isn't going to generalize real well to the content necessarily. So do assessments embedded in Tier 1 curriculum. Make word lists and see if the kids can read them out of the social studies text they're reading on Friday. Do it informally. Calibration, Tier 2 And special education teachers will meet, that's title and special ed, will meet to collaborate on classroom observations and Tier 1 teacher collaboration. So if you have a title person doing something and you as special ed are doing it, you both don't have to go in and look at the kids. You can look at each other's kids and then collaborate. So if you have those extra resources, it cuts down on the observation stuff. So overall, we have 2 minutes, 3 minutes. What are your reflections? So let me go, oh, doggone it. I thought I had, reflection for you. What are your thoughts? What is the biggest takeaway you have from this fire hose presentation? What are your thoughts? And that's interesting you say that, because the framework for multi-tiered system of supports takes the work you're already doing and makes it more systematic. It doesn't bring in new stuff. It might bring in a little new stuff in areas, but the real goal is to make this systematic and consistent and create a way to communicate and collaborate. Other thoughts? What are your thoughts in looking at this? You shouldn't have to think. You should have some gut reaction to this as well as a cognitive reaction to this.
More communication.
Huh?
Just the more communication between the gen and the
Yes.
ed teachers, and kind of an EL, and forcing them to have that collaboration and work together to make sure the kids get what they need.
In many of the places I work, EL teachers need a lot more support. They're often selected primarily because of their language skills, but may not be proficient in some of the process of teaching and learning as much. So I always look, special ed teachers need to, you already have the skills to do this. You just need to find the logistics and the opportunity and what have you. EL teachers may need some more support on how to do some of these tasks of utilizing materials and what have you. What are your other thoughts? We have time for 1.5 more thoughts. So I mentioned in one of the other sessions, I can't remember if it was this session as well, about the stuff I'm doing in Arkansas with novice special ed teachers. And they had to go sit in on 2 lesson planning meetings and do 2 observations. And another one of their epiphanies that I haven't shared is that at the lesson planning meeting that they went to, it wasn't very organized there, but they do have them. They do get together for the purpose of doing it. That's a start. The gen ed teachers spent most of their time grilling the special ed teachers on what they could do to help the kids in their class, and not even special ed kids. And the teachers came back and said, I think they learned more from us than we did from them. They asked us more questions than we asked them. But what I loved about that was if they were that enthusiastic and just like sucking their brains, they've never done this before. And if they're that at it, they're asking for opportunities to do that. So as you contemplate all of this, and you were very astute to mention this, there are some things that have to be done first. You have to have some conversations about this. And you have to have consensus around it, collaboration, visiting classes, sharing stuff. All of that can become part of the culture of your school. And then you can put the systematic process on it. If you don't have those other things, you can put a systematic process on it, but the human factor part of this is not going to work. So I hope that this provided some structure. Thank you for coming. We have a quick break. This is always an amazing conference, and I'm sure that you are benefiting hugely. I benefit when I come here just listening to people and learning from them. So thanks for coming. Have a wonderful weekend.